Okay. 2 seconds ago, you thought I was being a mime, but I wasn't. So welcome back again to the 4th installment of, I totally lost my place, of Basic Training Family Edition. And again, I would like to just express gratitude and thanks to Recovery Boot Camp and the Schnellenberger Family Foundation for making all this possible. Welcome back again. And those of you that are returning, I'm super excited to have you. And it shows a huge commitment to your own recovery and safety, which then by extension extends to your family members. And it's the best thing you can do to help them recover is to recover yourself. And before we start, I'd like to introduce my executive producer, Dave, again, who will bring us some logistical information and all the technical stuff that I don't know anything about.
Hey, everybody, welcome back. So I basically come on here to tell you guys if you have any technical difficulties to just send me a question in the question box there on the right side of your screen. And we get it. Listen, we had some difficulties this evening just getting started, but I think we've got everything squared away. So if you guys have any difficulties, we totally get it. We've been there literally minutes ago ourselves. So just shoot me a question. I'll do what I can to walk you through it, try and get you all squared away. Also, just like last week, we're going to be asking some poll questions throughout the webinar. All your answers are completely anonymous, so you should feel no pressure or like stress about answering them honestly. It's just for Rabbi Mark to help guide and steer the conversation a little bit. So periodically, I'm going to post some poll questions. So when you see the poll pop up, just do your best to answer as quickly as possible so we can keep Rabbi Mark's flow going. And he can guide the discussion. Lastly, I would say if you guys look in your chat box, I posted Nicholas Johnson's phone number. Nick is our Director of Admissions and Director of Communications at Recovery Boot Camp. So if you guys have any questions, if you have a loved one or someone who's thinking about getting help and you want to direct him somewhere, Nick's a great resource to have. He always answers the phone. So if you guys have any questions related to that part of this and admissions and intakes and things like that, please give Nick a call. And other than that, enjoy Rabbi Mark and tonight's webinar. And I'm going to turn it back over to the rabbi.
Welcome back again, everybody. And thank you all for coming. Just to dovetail on what Dave said, you know, I have to tell you that I think you're all very brave. And I say this because a lot of times we hear talk, especially in recovery circles, about the idea of fearlessness. And I don't really buy into that all that much. I think that there is a distinct difference between fearlessness and bravery. And I think that fearlessness is walking through life with a lack of fear, which would be awesome, but it would also not be human. Whereas bravery is doing the tough thing in spite of the fear that you have. Walking through that fear to have an enlightenment and an understanding. And that's really my hope and goal for this entire process of 10 weeks that I'm doing with you guys. And I just want it to be said that this is exactly the way that we approach the clients here at Recovery Boot Camp. We try to instill in them and give them the same instruction and inspiration that hopefully we're giving you to encourage you to make forward movement in your own life, to come to a place where the shame of the disease disappears, the understanding of the positive guilt that motivates you to do something proactive replaces it. You feel a sense of confidence and fulfillment about the work you're doing, and you become the person that no longer has to shy away from the issue, but really embrace it, because only through that embracing of our shadow and recognition that it's there right out of our peripheral vision, waiting to pounce on us, do we have the capacity to make forward momentum to healing in the long run. And so again, I want to thank again Recovery Boot Camp for this opportunity, and the Schnellenberger Family Foundation, which is an amazing project. So let's start off with a simple question, a poll question. And then we're starting on slide 36. And the poll question is, do you believe that your loved one wants to be sober? Questions up. I wish I could do the tick-tocky thing from Jeopardy, but I can't. Maybe I need a little button for the music. And we have the results. And the results are 83% of you say yes, and 17% of you say no. So now I guess the real thing is what we have to talk about is that important? Does it matter? Is it effective? So let's open that up with talking about the recovery model in depth. If you remember the last few weeks, we went through the medical models, the background, the history. We started to touch on the recovery model and its 3 prongs. And so let's get into it. Oops. Okay. So let's talk about, we're going to talk about treatment basics this week. We're going to get it into depth, the modalities, how we start initially, how we progress, how we go on, the different types of ways to motivate people, bring them in. And then we're going to talk about how the disease and certain parts of it actually go into remission, complete remission, in fact, though not cure. Remember, we talked about that before. And finally, we're going to talk about the most important part of it, which is the spiritual malady, which I touched on last week. It's a spiritual or existential sickness. That sickness, which we'll get into in depth, is really a major factor. So I think I'm going to close this slide with another poll question. And that question simply is do you believe that the desire to get sober is necessary to actually get sober? We totally need music for these things, like Muzak.
All right, I'm closing the poll.
And the poll is closing and the answers are coming. And the answers are 90% of you believe that it is absolutely necessary for the identified patient to have the desire in order to get sober. Wrong. What is? Oh, there we go. So I'm just going to tease you with that wrong, and we're going to start about the basics of treatment. So how do we get people into treatment? According to your poll answer, you believe that the person must have the desire to enter treatment. And that is not necessarily true. One of the most important things that we can do is maybe not allow them to want to go to treatment. So let me ask another quick poll question before we go on. Have you ever tried to coerce your loved one into getting sober?
Interesting responses.
Ooh. I'm going to assume that's probably a yes across the board a lot, huh? Yep.
Results are in.
And the results are About 84% of you have actually tried different methods to coerce your loved one to get into treatment. Now, I think I got to click it twice here. There we go. We absolutely can use coercion to get people to go into treatment. The problem tends to be that we attempt coercion as family members without understanding the subtleties that are necessary or even having professional input at times. And a lot of times that area can become gray, where we believe it's coercion, we believe it's tough love, we believe we're being forceful. But in reality, what we're actually doing is creating a blockade between the loved one and ourselves that makes them react in anger and frustration. I can't tell you how many times someone's told me, you drink too much. And I was like, really? I'll show you how much I drink. And it went the other way. But I'm here to tell you absolutely that coercion done correctly is highly effective. And the very first way that we tend to coerce people into entering treatment is through interventions. And interventions are any type of therapeutic vector that can bring a unified front to a person to cause them to stop enough where it's not just one person shaking their finger at them and telling them to go to treatment, but it tends to be a unified front of people that show kind of a majority opinion of what their life is in reflection to the people doing the intervention. And those interventions can be personal. You can do them yourself with your family. A lot of times I would recommend highly that you get some instruction or some input from professionals, BRIs, which are board registered interventionists, or people along that line. You can then do a professional interventions. You can hire an interventionist, and the way it works is usually there's a meeting with all the people that are going to be involved except the patient. There's some sort of approach, usually through cost letters or love letters, but you develop a plan. And that plan works in unity to bring a strong front to that person. And the interventionist is usually the guide and also the person that has the capacity through his connections to set up possible treatment venues for the addict and to really facilitate the logistics of when the person says yes to go into treatment. Now, I'm sure probably a couple of you have maybe watched the show Intervention once or twice on A&E. It's a great show. Now, a lot of times people will run away from the intervention. So the question is there really such a thing as a failed intervention? I personally, being in this business for as long as I have, believe that there is no such thing as a failed intervention. What tends to happen is if the intervention is done right, if there's a unified front, if the boundaries are set in that intervention, even if the person refuses treatment, it tends to speed up and facilitate their short-term downward slide to the point where they understand that a lot of their hustle options have been diminished, and it tends to come pretty quickly. Maybe a few days, maybe a week, maybe two down the line. So in essence, what I would say is that there's no such thing as a failed intervention. If you look at the intervention of the planting of a solid seed and preparing the ground for that thing to grow. And finally, one of the single most effective ones are legal interventions. The legal system has a way of instituting and regulating things that we as individuals or family members or even professionals do not. Oddly enough, what we find in terms of long-term results across the board in treatment is that people that have had a legal intervention tend to have a 15% to 20% probability of more success than people that enter of their own volition. It's really interesting because you can say, well, I decided to come to treatment. And the question is really, did you? Did you decide to come to treatment? Or did you decide to just leave the environment and the life that you had? A lot of times it's what we call a Hobson's choice. And we'll talk more about that at length as we go. What you can also do is engage in what's called induced bottoms. through a unified front with the family. And even when families are split, when it comes to the life of the identified patient or the child, a lot of times you have to get over the resentments that you have with your partners or ex-partners or other family members where there might have been strife and conflict, and come together for this single purpose, right? And that purpose is to save the life of the identified patient, which means that despite your resentments and problems, you need to bond together to be unified on this single thing. And through that, you can create a solid type of induced bottom. And those bottoms usually take the form of tough love, which is a solid approach where you have a strict drawn boundary that you will not cross, allowing the identified patient to become the one who decides to either go with the flow or step away. And when we're talking about commitments and interventions and induced bottoms, what we also need to talk about is the idea of commitment. And I mentioned this just previously, the difference between internal and external commitment. Even people that believe they have come to treatment of their own volition really do not have an internal commitment. When you talk to people, a lot of times, even very early in their treatment protocol, and when they're starting to feel a little comfortable, they're not sick, they've been through detox, you say, do you want to be sober? And they say, yeah, man, of course I want to be sober. It's a great question. It's a good answer. But the truth is do they really want to be sober? How can someone make an informed decision about something that is inherently foreign to them? If we're honest about it, they don't want to be sober. What they want is to not have the life of trauma and stress and sickness that they had prior. The idea is that everyone comes to treatment, comes to recovery, comes to sobriety through an externally driven commitment. That it's situations or circumstances that exist in my life that I find untenable, that I find horrible, that really cause me to be a miserable individual. And those are the things that force me to make this decision to leave that particular circumstance to go to this other circumstance, which is actually inherently unknown to me initially. One of the hardest problems about getting someone into treatment is that it tends to be the fact that the pain that they experience in their life is insufficient to push them past the fear of an unknown life of what could come. And so in recovery, it starts with that external commitment. And as we progress through the steps, through working through therapeutic approaches, that shifts. The feeling of starting to taste the flavor of the rewards of a different type of way to live is what brings us to the internal commitment. And really, that's one of the things that we intensely do here at Recovery Bootcamp. We engage in what are called micro interventions or microtherapeutic interventions. And this is a beautiful thing to do to clients, that you kind of push them to the point where they vacillate and become stressed enough that their discomfort enough is to take the next step forward into the unknown, but not so uncomfortable that it causes them to run away. And we approach the same methodology here. So let's move on to the next slide. And the next slide talks about an important part. And this part is vastly important because it's something that we hear a lot about, and then we hear the opposite. And what we're talking about is the remission of the disease of alcoholism and drug addiction. Remember that when we started to talk about the recovery model, we talked about the physical allergy. We had the graph and the way it cycles and the way the metabolism processes the alcohol and the drugs to a state where it gets stuck, and it causes what is called the phenomenon of craving. That my system doesn't understand that I should just stop. It makes me want to shove more into the system to flush it past into the process zone. And that's a problem, right? And that's the physical allergy. That's what creates the phenomenon of craving. The physical allergy is that first part. So we ask, can that physical allergy go into remission? Well, I would say that it could, in as much as any allergy can go into remission if you abstain from the thing that is allergic. So what is an allergic reaction? What is the definition of the idea of allergy? Well, if I have an allergy to peanuts, I don't eat them. If I don't eat them, I don't go into anaphylactic shock. I don't need to have an EpiPen, and God forbid I don't have one, I don't die. So an allergy is in fact an adverse reaction to a normally okay substance or process that really doesn't affect others in a negative way. However, people that are allergic have adverse reactions. We talked about this idea of food allergies. If I'm allergic to peanuts, even if I like the way they smell and feel that I would like peanut butter, I don't live in a house with scratch and sniff peanut butter wallpaper or have like the peanut shaped air freshener in my car because I want to keep it out of my head, right? It's the forbidden fruit. I know that I'm going to be tempted to go there, but I also know that I have that allergy. And the knowledge of that is enough to prevent me from putting my health and life in risk. Not so much for the alcoholic, because part of the allergy is this phenomenon of craving. I react problematically and wrong to the substance that I ingest. It doesn't process the right way, but the euphoria and the reward that occurs in my brain actually overrides my common knowledge that this thing is detrimental to me, that I know I'm gonna wake up with bruises and maybe smash my car and not know how I got home and get arrested, and all these problematic things that occur. The results of that allergy don't really affect me at all because it's overridden by that stress and reward center that occurs in the mesolimbic system. And that really happens in this process of metabolic reduction. So I conscientiously have an opposite reaction. I have this negative reaction. My body and metabolism doesn't process the product the way it should. I get jammed up. But instead of understanding conscientiously and intellectually that I should stop, it causes my system, my metabolic system, to fuel my brain to think more of a reward, because through that, that'll flush it through and maybe I'll process completely. So just to give an idea, let's review a picture slide that we saw previously. And this is a slide of the way ethanol is processed. It says that ethanol is C2H5OH, which could be a CH3 plus a CH2OH. But whatever the chemical compound is, it goes initially from the ethanol that I ingest into alcohol dehydrogenase, which I can't pronounce, and then into acetaldehyde. From that acetaldehyde, it goes into the next stage, which is acetone or acetate. That stage is really where it gets plugged up for alcoholics and heroin addicts. And it causes that pushing that it wants me. And really the recurrence of that is that, truthfully, I want my first drink. But boy, I really, really, really want my fifth drink. Same with any other drug. And there we see that that's the C2H5OH, and that's how the reduction works. And then I'm going to show you the slide I showed you before again. And before we go into it, let's ask another poll question. And that question is, do you believe that intelligence and reason can actually help to conquer addiction? And the results are adding up. And we have the results. And the results say a vast majority, 68% of you, believe that the answer is no, which is actually correct. However, even though reason by itself cannot conquer addiction, what occurs is that reason becomes an integral part of the other processes that I develop. I act my way into right thinking. The end result is that my thought processes, which are now reinforced by my initial behavioral modification, become the driver that creates increased positive behavior. So let's talk a little bit about the obsession, right? The mental obsession, the second part. We already covered the physical allergy, and it can in fact go into remission. And it goes into remission simply by abstinence. And the truth is it goes into immediate remission simply by abstinence. And if it was just that factor that represented the disease of addiction, it would be easy to handle. You just wouldn't drink. The problem is we have a mental obsession coupled with that. It's as though I lived in that house with scratch and sniff wallpaper that was peanut butter flavored, and I had the peanut butter thing, and I kept pictures of peanuts all over my house, and my refrigerator was full of peanuts, and all I wanted to do, let me just taste it 1 second, and kept pushing it away, because on top of that allergy, I am now obsessed intellectually and psychologically with having that forbidden fruit that I couldn't have. And so what it creates is a circular process. And I went through this last week. And those of you that understood what I said, understood what I said. And those of you that didn't were baffled. And this is what I said. When I'm drinking, I'm thinking about drinking when I'm not drinking, because when I want to drink, I have to not drink to drink so I can understand when I'm going to drink. Because if I don't have a drink in me, then I can't have a drink. And later I have to think about drinking when I'm not drinking so I can drink later. If you get it, you're probably an alcoholic. So what does the big book say about this bizarre mental obsession that tends to throw all logic out of the way, all reason and rationale? It simply says, there is always a curious mental phenomenon that parallel with our sound reasoning. There inevitably ran some insanely trivial excuse for taking the first drink. And that's what it is. We are fully cogent and fully aware that this is going to be detrimental to us. But that phenomenon of craving, which is a physicality, stimulates our desire in an obsessive kind of circular reality. Listen, you can obsess about golf, you can obsess about working out, you can obsess about eating correctly. These are also obsessions. And when we track them neurologically, they become habituated for us. But they're not detrimental. They're good, right? The problem is as addicts and alcoholics, we have that obsession with something that we intellectually know is terrible for us, because this is the phenomenon that I have absolute sound reasoning, which is cogent and factual, yet all of a sudden a random, absolutely insanely trivial reason for me to drink overrides that. And that's exactly what happens. And that's the pathology of the mental obsession. And here we see it again in this slide. So I have some sort of emotional trigger. Ooh, I got a hangnail. Or Susie didn't look at me the way I had an expectation she should. Or, I sent her a card and she never called me. I saw her open it in front of the mailbox and just chuck it in the garbage. Small, trivial, right? What this does is starts the circular pattern, which then also reacts with my physical craving, starts me to crave. So I start to have a ritual. I got to go and buy booze, and then I'm going to show her, like, I'll do this, and then I drink. And what happens? I'm then flooded with guilt and shame, which then stimulates a new insanely trivial emotional trigger that starts the entire process over and over again. And I run through a shame to action, shame of the action back to the action, shame of that action back to the action. And it never, never stops. What we see in the next slide is an interesting relationship. We can see the difference in the lower half of the slide between the non-addicted brain and the addicted brain. So if you look at control and self-regulation, which is that blue bubble on the top, in the non-addicted brain, that is the logic and reasoning. And it has a deep impact on the actual drive that occurs right, in the OFC. So in the alcoholic brain, that logic just doesn't have the impact it does. What has the impact is the memory of the response. So I have stress that comes from the desire and not wanting to drink at work, and my girlfriend isn't talking to me, or this, that, and the other. So what overrides that is this fond memory of, oh, it's going to be so awesome to have that first cocktail, right? And that influences the part of our brain that's bathed in salience, that understands what I should do. What happens is it goes to the drive, and the drive says go, as opposed to the non-alcoholic brain, where control and self-regulation predicated on intellect and reason stops that. It's that insanely trivial thing that makes us, in fact, pick up that drink. And we see that in the next slide. Again, the mental obsession. So let me give you another quote. And this quote is from page 22 in the 12 and 12. The 12 and 12 is a book that Bill Wilson wrote after 20 some odd years of being sober, explaining the theoreticals and the emotional constructs of the steps and the traditions. And he writes, smitten by an insane urge that condemned us to go on drinking. That urge is completely separate from our intellect. What occurs in essence is we get that urge, usually fueled by an insanely trivial reason or some sort of perceived flaw, not a flaw like we got poked or insulted, and we cannot, to the best of our ability, conscientiously derail that thought train. It is just, it's like the movie Silver Streak. It's about to crash through Grand Central Station. So that is what we're looking at in terms of the physical allergy and the mental obsession. So we know the physical allergy can go into remission. Can the mental obsession go into remission? Well, the fact is that it absolutely can. And sometimes it happens almost immediately with abstinence from drugs and alcohol. And sometimes it's related to the half-life of that chemical as it starts to lose potency in our brain over a period of time, which is called post-acute withdrawal. And as those chemicals diminish in the adipose tissue of our brain, eventually we hit that half-life. We have kind of a critical desire for a short period of time, and then we smooth out. But what we find is people that have intense experiences, a static kind of conditioning, especially in recovery, and here at RBC we do that. We bring an intensity to that experience. We utilize the group modality, the mob mindset, to get guys together to bring what is educationally a single intellectual experience into a group mode where it becomes a static in nature. And that, a lot of times, an intense static experience, even though it's not a white light, burning bush kind of a thing, but more of a group cheering on, can actually diminish that obsession with rapid ways. And that's what happens. And so in reality, I put the physical allergy into complete and total remission solely by abstinence. And abstinence itself is the major contributor to my mental obsession going into full remission. So the real question is, if my physical allergy goes in complete and total remission, and so does my mental obsession, albeit maybe at a little slower pace, but let's say a month or 2 months in, I have no desire, I don't think about drinking or using, and I have no physical response. I am in essence in remission of the physicality of my disease. Why do so many people relapse? Why do I go back to drinking? And the answer is simple. I go back to drinking because I have a spiritual malady, a sickness. So here's another poll question, and it's an interesting one. Do I think, even as the parent of or family member of an alcoholic, do I believe that I myself am experiencing a crisis of faith, either in my reliance on religion or my reliance on science? specifically because of this seemingly continuous, never-ending struggle. Excuse me. And the numbers are coming in fast and furious. I just said that because it sounded cool to say. But here are the results. It's almost about split. So a lot of you are struggling with this crisis that my faith and my reliance on science and my reliance on religion and my reliance on things that I know are causing me still to doubt what I know, which is quite a common reality. And it's because, why would I ask this question? Well, because this struggle is really at the core of what a spiritual malady is. It is a crisis and conflict and dialogue in my head where I am split about how I feel, how I think I'm supposed to feel, how I think the world wants me to feel, and how I know the world should feel about how I feel. Again, one of those convoluted alcoholic sentences, but really true. But here's the thing about the spiritual malady. So the reason I asked the question is because if you answered in the affirmative and you're in somewhat of a conflict, you are yourself experiencing a spiritual malady of a lower kind of level. And you just saw the next thing pop up. And it says never in remission. And this can crush people. Because if my physical allergy can go into complete remission, and my mental obsession can also go into remission, and my spiritual malady never goes into remission, how can all my faith and research and work ever sustain my recovery? Well, it can't. Because the spiritual malady is a continuum. Because as we grow, and as we develop and as we mature and become more sophisticated in our self-awareness and understand nuance and minutia of our lives, then we can actually treat and manage the symptoms of that malady. And I will have that malady and spiritual existential crisis as long as I'm alive. The problem is that when I let those crises become trivial realities that I then hyper-catastrophize, which causes me to obsess about drinking as the solution and then jump in and drink and the physical allergy starts again, I'm doomed to repeat. Because in reality, the spiritual malady is the first to go when I start to drink and use addictively. That my internal moral compass and the way that I deal with my own level of authenticity starts to diminish. And in fact, it is the last thing to return in recovery because it becomes the result of the process of the cognitive steps that are didactic and dialectic and neurolinguistic in the 12-step paradigm. The basic training of all recovery is this process of 12 steps. Because this process is not a pseudo-religious reality. It is a cognitive therapy, it is a dialectic and didactic therapy, and it is a neurolinguistic therapy. And these are the three strongest forms. Now, it is not pseudo-religious, it is not semi-cultish, it is clinical. However, the result of that clinical work is a spiritual or existential enlightenment. So let's talk about that. One of the main things that troubles us in the spiritual malady is, in fact, trauma. Now, a lot of times when I talk to family members, I say one of the most important traumas that we see that clients in treatment tend to experience is the trauma of abandonment and rejection. And when I first say that to family members, a lot of times they'll get offended. I didn't abandon my child. I didn't reject them. And the truth is you didn't. But the other truth is the perception of the addict at that time was that of abandonment and rejection, because trauma is real or perceived, and they both influence each other. What I have as perceived trauma can become real trauma, and real trauma that is minute can become overblown and hyper-catastrophized into a greater imagined trauma, which then makes it that real trauma as well. Because those traumas inherently rest in the addict's favorite friend, the friend of delusion. Delusion is the belief in something as being absolutely true to the extent that I let it dictate my actions, which then reinforces the validity of that delusion and makes it that much more true for me. In other words, it's about fantasies. And one of the beauties of being a human being, which is also kind of the downside, is that our ability to contemplate our reality and contemplate others, and what separates us from every other mammal on the planet, is our fully developed prefrontal cortex. On one hand, it's amazing, because if it was literal, I would never be able to see a movie, because I'd watch Star Wars and go, there's no people in space, things don't explode, there's no travel effect. This is nonsense. I wouldn't be able to read a book. I wouldn't be able to do anything. I wouldn't be able to think outside of the box, because the beauty and the curse of the PFC is that it cannot distinguish between things that are real and things that are imagined. And sometimes it's kind of a bear, but other times it's the thing that allows us to get sober, because what I do is I fake it till I make it. What is that? Do I pretend to do the action until some random result occurs? Absolutely not. And you hear this a lot in the rooms of 12-step and in recovery in general. And this is one of the things that we like to do here at RBC. We try to take those ideas, those sayings that you hear all the time, and really unpack them. For instance, fake it till you make it. Most people, just pretend to do the action and then the results will happen. That's not it. Fake it till you make it means something completely different. It means using that inability to distinguish between true and false, creating a paradigm that actually makes it true. Let me explain. I don't fake the work. I either do the work or I don't. So I do the work. What I fake is I pretend to be the guy that believes it'll work. So my faking is the pretense in the efficacy of what I'm doing. And what happens? It starts to work. And the pretense in believing that it'll work goes from being a pretense to being a fact. So the faking leaves without me even noticing, because I am the guy that says, this is going to work. This is going to work. I know this is going to work. I'm going to do it because I know it's going to work. I know it's going to work. Even if I don't, I say that. I try to pretend to be the guy that believes it'll work. And it starts working. And I'm no longer pretending that it is. I am no longer pretending that it is. So let's talk a little bit about the spiritual malady in terms of something that we hear all the time. One of the favorite words of anybody that's ever even thought about addiction and recovery, or even group therapy: denial. So denial is an interesting thing. It's become, commonplace in the vernacular of modern times. But the truth is what is denial? Well, this may sound a little harsh, but I think denial is a crock of boo-boo, because it's soft and it's, you're in denial. Well, denial is part of the prefrontal cortex. It's actually a coping skill for people that are not addicts, that don't suffer from a physical and allergy and a mental obsession, that do not find that their coping skills are the single most deadly on the planet. It's highly effective part of our brain. It allows us to compartmentalize things that are painful so that we can go about our business. In fact, it's so ancient that it's even talked about in Isaiah in the Bible. You know, he says, your heart is fat and your eyes are shut and your ears are plugged. Because if you felt with your heart and saw with your eyes and heard with your ears, you would see the truth and you would have to repent and be healed. So, I don't know, what, 3,000 years ago, we already understand this ideal condition of denial? This is what we like to say in recovery. Denial. Don't even notice I am lying. And it kind of came into fruition in the consciousness of Americans in the 70s with, like, you know, all the group therapies and all this kind of stuff. Well, let me tell you what Dr. Silkworth said about what we now call denial. And remember, we talked about Dr. Silkworth, who wrote the Doctor's Opinion in the history of AA, as one of the first things that really kind of codified the disease of addiction. And it happened with Dr. Silkworth prior to the AMA accepting it, with a study done by Dr. Jelinek at Harvard. And what Dr. Silkworth says is very simple. We are not in denial. What are we as true addicts that suffer from this disease? We are people who are outright mental defective. That means our intelligence and rationale and reason can be overrun by an insanely trivial reason to pick up that drink. We are in full flight from reality. I'm not an alcoholic. I don't drink that much. What are you talking about? In fact, I'll show you I'm not an alcoholic. Let me have a drink and I'll show you. And we are unable to differentiate between true and false. And oddly enough, these are traits of every human being on the planet. The only difference is for us with this mesolimbic disease, these traits become absolutely deadly. Should we go into Q&A? So we have about 10 minutes on the clock, more or less. Do you have any questions, Dave?
Sure do, Mark.
All right.
All right, so first question I have.
Excuse me.
And, you know, she says that this is a really big issue within their family, so it's a pretty personal question. But she wants to know, how big a role does entitlement play in the phenomena of addiction?
An incredibly huge amount, right? And there's kind of a reason. And it reflects back on what we were talking about just a few slides earlier, trauma. Trauma as a perceived reality for the addict, who we know organically has an overload of oxytocin, one of the 7 major markers in the allele system in the genetic profile of alcoholism and drug addiction, which inherently means they feel as though they feel things more intensely than other people because, 1, they think it, and 2, they kind of do. So if I am that person, I'm going to hyper-catastrophize even the smallest things. And like any other human being who generally doesn't want to own responsibility for their actions, I'm going to replay that tape in my head over and over and over. And because I have this certain quirk, what I'm going to do is just alter the script ever so slightly in each replay until I arrive at the point where it's not my fault. I didn't do that. It's not my fault. And when it's not my fault, I'm now a victim. And when I'm a victim, I now become eminently entitled to behave any way I want. And so if the universe is inherently trying to crush me under the weight of its thumb, I'm entitled to do whatever I want, and I'm entitled to be treated in a certain way. I'm entitled to be treated like an adult and taken care of like a child because I deserve that, because up until this point, the trauma in my life, albeit imagined, is so overwhelming that I am a continuous victim of life itself. Entitlement's huge, huge, huge. And it really, I don't want to point the blame, but I mean, in some instances, it's because of upbringing, but it's really not that much about upbringing. It's about the development of this neurological quirk of alcoholics and addicts, where in the same system, you have one child absolutely not entitled, the other one completely entitled. And it tends to be one of the byproducts of major disease of alcoholism.
Dare we tell our viewers what we do with entitlement at Recovery Boot Camp?
Oh, God, yeah. Okay, so here at Recovery Boot Camp, I I don't know. Is it safe to say we have a zero tolerance on entitlement? Yeah, I would safe to say that. And basically, if you're entitled and you want to whine and complain and call your mom and have her pay your rent or do some other stuff for you, either get your shit together or kick rocks. And we don't tell them that way. Sometimes we do. But mostly what we do is we offer them a solution. And the solution is, okay, you've got this problem, this dilemma. You can whine about it and be entitled and wait for somebody to fix it to you. Or I can give you 4 or 5 different options for solution. And you yourself as a human being can decide whether you want to wallow in the problem or engage in the solution. And a lot of times that entitlement creates a sort of laziness or a reticence to do the work. So we push them, and we push them with these therapeutic interventions. A lot of them are psychological. I'm going to share a secret with you now, okay? I might have shared it before, but now I'm going to really tell you up front. My entire job as a treatment professional is to use the skills that I developed as a degenerate, miscreant alcoholic and drug addict, those skills of manipulation, lying, cajoling, and I'm going to use those skills to convince every entitled alcoholic and addict. I'm going to trick them through that skill set into doing something they absolutely don't want to do because they're entitled. And I'm going to make them do it through trickery and chicanery. And then after they do it, I'm going to manipulate them again to make them think that it was their idea in the first place. I have just told you the secret of my entire career. That is my job in a nutshell. And that's kind of what we do with people that are entitled. We use the skills that we had because we too were entitled and flip the script on them. It's pretty effective.
Okay, so I got another question, but I just want everyone to make sure they know that if they have any questions, now's the time, right? Just type them in that question box and we'll get through as many as we can. And if we don't get to any of your questions, we'll get to them later after the webinar. But please send them in, type away. We're here for you guys. Okay, so the next question I have is, can a person who got sober by being in jail develop internal motivation and commitment?
Yes and no. It depends whether they got abstinent in the penitentiary or sober. I myself was active in World Service of Alcoholics Anonymous for years, specifically in corrections committees. And things have changed in the last few years vis-a-vis correctional facilities. And the reason is because some of it's because they become privatized, some is because there's a higher population. But suffice it to say that correctional facilities have a primary purpose, much like recovery does. The primary purpose of correction facilities is punishment and security. And the primary purpose of most 12 steps is to carry the message of recovery to other people. It used to be that we could bring AA and NA and CA meetings into penitentiaries, but because of the circumstances that exist, it's much harder to do it now. There's been a shift in the mindset of most 12 AA service structures over the last, 10 to 15 years. The idea is to grow organic meetings within the penitentiary. And those meetings have their own group number, have their own general service representative that can bring the information down the chain and bring it back up. Kind of hard to do when you're locked up. But what we find is that generally, a lot of times, the inmate service representative, or more specifically the drug and alcohol counselor that's at most correctional facilities, tends to be sober. And we try to work out a way where they can be their general service representative. So we grow these fellowships within the penitentiaries. What we found, according to government numbers, and in fact specifically released probably in the last 2 years, is that generally speaking, about 82% of people that are incarcerated are addicts. And they're either there for a primary drug offense, secondary offense to fill their drug habit, or a tertiary violent crime to support their habit as well. Now, what we see is that the recidivism rate of people in the penitentiary is quite high. And that's because it's punishment oriented. When there is an organic fellowship that develops inside the penitentiary, what we find is that people that really become sober, not just abstinent, not just staying out of the drama and craziness in the pen, but become become truly sober, work the steps. There are entire programs that are called Steps Beyond the Walls, where they're pen pals with sponsors outside and they work the steps that way. If they can acquire about 3 years of true sobriety within the penitentiary, amazingly, the recidivism rate consistently drops from the 70 percentile down to between the 15 and 25 percentile. So it is possible to be self-developed if you develop the recovery skills in the penitentiary, if you're engaged in a 12-step paradigm or even a church-based paradigm. But what we find is that that's what has to happen. Abstinence alone is just a separation. And a lot of times the motivation for that separation is to not catch extra beef or extra cases when you're inside, to extend your time. You want to get out, get off a paper, and then be free to do what you want. So abstinence alone is not quite the solution to that problem. Did that cover it?
Yeah,
okay.
Absolutely. So we have another follow-up question on entitlement.
Ooh, good one.
And this person
I don't want to answer that.
But before I give the question, I hope everybody is okay with this, but due to our own technical difficulties at the beginning of the webinar, we were thinking about going maybe 5 or so minutes over past the normal end time so we can get a couple extra questions in. So don't go anywhere at 9 o'clock. We're going to have 1 or 2 more questions after that.
Because my elapsed counter is less.
It's okay.
Okay. I don't know.
So, Mark.
Yes.
Can you give a concrete example of diffusing entitlement?
Concrete example of diffusing entitlement.
Like what? Like a recovery boot camp, for example.
Okay. Perfect one. So, we're kind of getting into a gray area here, but let me try to be as vague and specific as possible simultaneously. So we have a client, let's call him client A specifically, who's been struggling to get through a certain part of his steps, okay? And we're in a process group because he's a more advanced client, and he believes that, you know, I'm doing what I need to do, even though I'm really slacking on it. And I know that if something goes sideways, I got it out. My friends will help me. I'll go to this other facility, or I'll call my mom and she'll take me back because I'm super sober right now. I've got 3 months. And how do we diffuse that? Well, basically what I do is first I give him some information, you know, and I usually catch him in a lie. Well, he goes, well, I'm okay. I'm doing this. I'm doing great. I'm like, oh, you're doing great. Why is it taking you so long to do this, this, and this? Here you are standing in front of me with an air of ego about your sobriety, but yet your sobriety is really just abstinence because you're not forcing yourself to do that. So I give him the basic idea. And of course, because I'm the authority figure, it's generally rejected. So what we do is we allow a peer assessment to occur, right? And the people that are at the same level as him, that are further along or getting more and more rewards, say, look, you know, we love you, bro, but you're not. You're doing this. And I know this because I did the same thing. And when I was able to push myself past that piece of being entitled to not do it or thinking I had something coming because I'm amazing, that's when I got hit with the reality stick and I had to force myself through. So a lot of times we use this peer assessment in order to let people see that their peers, their friends went through the exact same thing a week prior or 2 week priors. And maybe they can spare them the expense of that emotional pain that occurred and help motivate them. Plus, a lot of times that entitlement or that laziness, because laziness and procrastination are a huge form of entitlement, that it makes them want that because they feel left out. Because even though an addict is deeply entitled, one of the biggest things that still lingers even in recovery is the desire to have people like you and to feel a part of in your group. And if you feel that your group is leaving you, it's good motivation to get off your butt and do what you need to do. I try to make it as specific possible and as vague as possible. Sorry. Or let's say somebody doesn't want to make their bed. What do? You toss their rum. You make them make their bed. Or having trouble making your bed? I understand it's hard. Well, why don't you do this? Why don't I stand here while you make your bed? And then when you're done, I can follow you around while you pick up cigarette butts in the courtyard every day for the next week. I know you don't want to do that, so maybe that will help you. Oh, you don't want to do that? Well, I can send you to another halfway house, be more comfortable there, right? That's the truth. Here at this facility, we understand what an intense intervention is about, which means that we are willing to put someone out for their own good, then allow ourselves to enable them to continue to procrastinate and be entitled to the detriment of themselves and at times the toxicity they create in their community around them.
Okay, so we're going to try and get through 2 more questions.
Let's do them.
First one is, if abandonment is at the core of an addict's trauma, how is that worked through for spiritual healing?
Okay, we're getting into some deep things now. So,
well,
I got the pen.
Oh God.
I was gonna write stuff, but then he gave me a look. So.
Well, they might not be able to see it. So.
Okay, so let's do it this way. So, abandonment and rejection. What are they? Well, in layman's terms, it's deeply connected to the last question, which is entitlement. Abandonment is not getting. Abandonment is someone taking what I have. And rejection is not getting what I want. And these are things that I create through my sense of entitlement because I believe I just deserve them because I am who I am. And what that translates into is that abandonment and rejection is that it causes me to, again, fall into the victim pathology and then take what I want or try to steal what I want or connive and manipulate to get what I want. The problem is that I tend to conflate what I want and what I need because I have an overinflated ego coupled with a very low sense of self-esteem. In other words, I'm a narcissist that hates myself. So how do I bring it to a spiritual paradigm? Well, really the only way, and I don't want to sound too preachy here, but bringing divinity into that mix is really the solution. And the way that we do it is very simple. I ask them, are you dead? No. Could you have been? Yes, on numerous occasions. That means that whatever concept you have of powers greater than yourself or a universal consciousness or an order of the systemic reality needs you here, which means it loves you enough, it accepts you enough, it doesn't reject or abandon you enough, and the proof is you're not dead. Because each one of you know countless people in your same situation that are. That's not to say that God loved those people less. It's to say that they were unable or unwilling to operate within the system to fulfill the desire of that God or that system in their life. And the system erased them from the equation. It gave them enough chances because it wanted them here, but they refused those and they're gone. Do you want that to happen? Or do you want to be the man that you can be? Right? And what it boils down to in the backside of that abandonment and rejection, which is not getting what I want, someone taking what I have, feeds into my resentment protocol, which is somebody didn't do something for me or they did something to me. So on one hand, and this is the umbrella of expectations, right? I deserve something, I didn't get it. Didn't get what I wanted, somebody took what I had. And when they did that, I'm now a victim, which means that I should be mad at everybody that didn't do something for me or did something to me. And if those two things come into play, I'm able to do whatever I want, regardless of any moral or spiritual paradigm. And that's how I end up dead.
Okay. So this one may be getting a little bit ahead of us, so I don't know if you want to give away the farm per se.
The farm.
This is from a mom.
Mom. Hi, Mom.
And she says, as a mom or as a mother, I struggle between the line of enabling and being a person of faith, of organized religion. And in parentheses, she puts placing others' needs before your own, gentleness, meekness, kindness, etc. So she goes on to say that her method is to assist if she can in recovery, but not to contribute to active addiction or relapse. But again, she struggles with where she draws the line.
Okay. So, awesome. Super brave of you, super committed of you, and having that paradigm of I'm going to help with recovery and not enable with detriment is great. Difficulties come in the minutia of each question. which are a case-by-case thing. You need to really train yourself to understand the fine line between helping and enabling. But let's address the person of faith issue. And I'm going to make it very simple. It's very, very simple. If we go to the Old Testament, the OT, or the Christian or the Jewish scriptures, and we look in Ecclesiastes, it also exists in Psalms, and even in the text, we are told repeatedly that a rebuke with love is at times more effective and valid than a blessing. Right? I give the blessings when they need to be given, but I rebuke with love so the person can bless themselves. Just drop a little religious stuff on you. But a rebuke with love is in fact an act of generosity and love. That's what you have to remember. Tough love is not just tough, it's tough love, right? A rebuke of love is a true act of generosity and kindness.
Okay.
Okay?
So I think we're going to wrap it up.
So let me just thank you all for being here. Again, let me commend your bravery and your desire to make your life better and the lives of the people you love better. And let me just remind you that if any of you have any questions or have any family or loved ones that you want to see in treatment or want to get in treatment, feel free to call Nick. He's an amazing guy. And we offer here the exact same teachings that we're giving you to the clients. Only they have it more hours during the day, more intimate, more personal, more body language and affect, more community. And I don't know, it's awesome. You know, Gandhi said there is nothing so fulfilling as bearing witness to the transformation of the human spirit. It's my favorite part about the job. Here's Dave again.
So lastly, just before we sign off for the evening, I just wanted to let you guys know that in the chat box, if you want to take a look, I just posted our website as well as Nick's contact information. So if you want to learn more about us and our staff, in addition to Rabbi Mark, you can go on our website, which is www.recoverybootcamp.com. And also, I'm not sure if you guys saw it, some of you were asking me individual questions about if you showed up late or you weren't able to watch last week's webinar, how you're able to access it. You can also do that through our website. So I posted the link, and you just go to recoverybootcamp.com and click on the Family tab, and then go into Basic Training Family Edition. And that's where you'll see all of our past webinar sessions, as well as all the handouts with all the slides that Rabbi Mark is talking about, as well as some assessments for you guys to fill out. And if you can, fill those out, because at the end of this webinar, we're going to do it again and see if we've made any progress. Hopefully we have. I'm pretty sure we're on our way. So I think that's all I have. Mark, do you have anything you'd like to add?
Yeah, absolutely. Progress is being made. Your questions are more specific, more sophisticated, more erudite, and more on point. With everything that you learn, it opens a new question on what you want to know. I bless you all. God bless you. I love you. I hope I see you next week.
Thank you so much, guys. We'll see you next Thursday. Have a good week.